Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to the All Me podcast. My name is Tavis Fiatoli, sports dietitian with the Taylor Hooten Foundation, and today I'm going to be your host. Coffee is one of the most widely consumed beverages in the world, as in 2021, over 166 million bags of coffee was consumed. An 8-ounce cup of coffee can have anywhere between 60 and 135 milligrams of caffeine, depending on the type. But why do so many people need their caffeine fix? Market research tells us roughly 70% drink it for taste, while 62% consume it for an extra boost of energy, and 34% have some form for added focus. Did you know caffeine is also an ergogenic aid? And in this podcast, we speak with Dr. Rebecca Randell from the Gatorade Sports Science Institute to define an ergogenic aid, the benefits of caffeine for athletes, and are there any health benefits and side effects from consuming caffeine? Dr. Randell is a scientist with a background in exercise physiology and sports nutrition. Her current role involves managing and supporting GSSI service engagements in LATAM and international. Rebecca is also involved in developing novel technologies to support athletic performance. She is passionate about sports nutrition and enjoys working with athletes to design appropriate and personalized nutritional strategies. She has extensive experience working with club elite athletes such as Olympic distance runners, Ironman triathletes, FC Barcelona, and CBF. She continues to author publications in peer-reviewed journals and deliver invited presentations in the UK and abroad. We'd like to thank our partners at Gatorade for sponsoring this podcast. Dr. Randell, thank you so much today for joining the All Me podcast, but also welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks. Nice to be back.
Good. It's great to have you in the Gatorade Sports Science Institute team, always providing incredible information for us and our listeners. And today's topic is something that a lot of people are very familiar with, the world of caffeine, right? Because we have a lot of people who drink coffee, and in my hand right now is a cup of decaf coffee, but I also had a little caffeine earlier. You have 2 cups of coffee, or is that tea?
One cup for tea, 1 cup for coffee on the go.
Well, good. Well, let's kind of dive into this because this is a very popular topic and people want to know how does this maybe impact health, performance, and we'll kind of answer those questions. So the first question I have for you, number one, is what is caffeine, right? So let's kind of talk about that. Can you just kind of give us a little brief explanation of what caffeine is?
Sure. So in most incidences, caffeine is a naturally occurring ingredient or chemical found in a variety of beverages, such as coffee, which we've already talked about. And there's obviously many different types of tea, and some which contain more caffeine in than others. Chocolate has an amount of caffeine in it, and it's often added to some soft drinks. What's good to know about caffeine is that it has no nutritional value unless you consume it with other ingredients. So, if I have some milk or cream in my coffee, then it will have some calories associated, or I will ingest some calories with it. And then sometimes, like sports gels or some drinks or energy drinks will have caffeine in, and then there'll also be some carbohydrate, which is also present. So then there will be some calories associated with that as well. But as you said, it's consumed like worldwide in a variety of like social settings, and then also the sporting setting as well.
Yeah, no, some of these people today, they're drinking their frozen drinks and their caffeinated drinks in the morning. And I'm like, that's got about 700 or 800 calories. That's not really a coffee. That's more like a milkshake with caffeine. It's kind of funny. Yeah. Let's talk about a little bit about the effects, right? Because we know caffeine has different effects. First question really is, what are the effects that caffeine has on the body once it's consumed?
Yes, so caffeine is a stimulant, and it acts on our central nervous system. So the reason that many people consume caffeine is to make them feel more awake. Well, that's definitely one of the reasons why I use it. And this is because throughout the day, our adenosine levels, they increase in our brain. And that's due to the breakdown of the ATP, which is we use for energy. So as we're using like the energy throughout the day, we get this increase in adenosine. And this adenosine attaches to receptors which are in our brain, and it makes us feel sleepy. But the chemical structure of caffeine is very similar to that of adenosine. So the caffeine then binds to these adenosine receptors, and it stops the adenosine binding, and it prevents us from feeling sleepy. So that's one of the, I guess, things that happens once caffeine is consumed.
Yeah, so it's like as you mentioned, a chemical process. People don't think about the biochemistry of caffeine. They just think I consume it, maybe I have some more energy, maybe I do this or that, and it's a complex model, right? A complex chemical figure. So one of the things I've heard a lot about, and some people ask in some of the programs we do, is how long, once I consume caffeine, how long does it stay in the system?
Yeah, so once caffeine is consumed, it normally takes around 45 minutes to 1 hour to peak in our body. And it can stay in our system for around 2 to 4 hours or even more. So it can stay in our system for quite a long time. Our genetics do play a role or a part in how quickly the caffeine is broken down and removed from the body. So yeah, our genetics can definitely play a role. But also the absorption of caffeine is reduced if we consume it in a postprandial state. So food or any food that we have eaten, especially something like fiber, which can sit in the gut for a while, can delay how quickly the caffeine peaks in the blood. So that's why, sometimes if you have a coffee or something with caffeine in first thing in the morning and you have it on an empty stomach, it will be absorbed much quicker, and sometimes you can feel that when you've had it straight away.
Yeah, and I agree with that genetics piece, because I drank so much caffeine in college and then realized, wow, I'm really sensitive, right? And we'll talk about some of the side effects later, but for me, it was arrhythmias. It was like, oop, that's why I kind of focus more on the decaf side now. But you mentioned genetics. Do you know if there's any dependence on, like, does that time frame in the body have any impact on maybe the size of that individual? So a 100-pound individual versus a 300-pound individual, does that factor at all on how long it stays in their system?
Yeah, I'm not actually sure on that point. Because in a lot of the research studies that look at caffeine ingestion in a sporting context, give a dose which is per milligrams of your body weight. And I'm not actually sure the rationale behind why we do it per grams of our body weight. But I think it's also just an individual thing. And like what you were saying, I have some people that I know that they can't drink caffeine after a certain amount of time because they feel like it will keep them up. Whereas I'm someone that drinks it right until I go to bed, and I can still fall asleep okay. We'll talk about some of the side effects as you say later on. But yeah, I'm not quite sure the role of body weight and how that plays in how long it stays in the system.
Now, we know we have different sources, right? You showed me you have a cup of tea and a cup of coffee. So with those different sources, is there a benefit for maybe one over the other? Does caffeine from tea provide any different benefits from maybe caffeine from coffee?
Yeah, and I guess that depends what you're defining as beneficial.
Right.
So anything with caffeine in is going to get into the system, depending on if you're having it with food, it might delay it. As I said, it might delay that absorption into the system. But caffeine is like one of the most studied ingredients and supplements in the sports nutrition world, because it's been shown to have like a benefit on performance. And we can talk about this in a bit more detail later on. But the traditional form of caffeine administration in research, especially in the athletic setting, for a long time was to ingest the caffeine in tablets or capsules, along with like water to ingest the caffeine, because it's quickly swallowed and then the majority absorbed into the blood from the intestines. And then also caffeinated sports drinks have been studied for many years as well. But now we also have caffeine that's available in gels, in bars, in gums, in dissolvable mouth strips. And that might affect how quickly the caffeine is absorbed into the blood from the mouth and the intestines. So yeah, we can get caffeine in many different ways, and then now at the moment there's lots of different forms that we can ingest caffeine in.
Yeah, and I've seen, even, I know we're not talking weight loss today, but on the green tea side, right? Everyone asks, does green tea help with weight loss? And I'm like, yeah, maybe there's some studies that show a slight increase in metabolic activity, but that's probably not going to be the reason why you're losing weight. It's going to be more calorie deficit.
It's really interesting. My PhD was on green tea supplementation.
And what did you find?
Well, I looked at fat oxidation rates during exercise, so didn't look at weight loss and didn't look at the resting condition. And I found green tea didn't increase fat oxidation rates. But yeah, there are some studies that did show green tea to increase weight loss, but you need to take that into the bigger context of also thinking about your energy intake. So if your energy intake is higher than your energy expenditure, regardless of how much green tea you ingest, you're probably not going to see a massive weight loss.
Yeah, no, I think people are always looking for just a magic pill. Like, they don't want to put in the work. They don't want to, change their eating habits. It's like, if I could just take this will help me. No, that's not going to solve the problem of habits. All right.
Yeah, and one thing about like the different like sources and forms of caffeine, there was a really good paper done by Ben Desbrow in Australia, and he looked at all the different caffeine contents of like pods of caffeine pods, and they ranged like massively, like they even like the same batch had different contents of caffeine in, and I think it was like over 100% different to what the manufacturers said was the value of caffeine on the packaging. So it can be like really variable depending on like how you take the caffeine and where you get it from.
Absolutely. Good. That's great. It's great. No. Now, we talked about the performance side, right? And we know caffeine is a pretty effective ergogenic aid. But before we kind of dive into the science and some of the work that's been done, for our listeners, when they hear the word ergogenic aid, they might be like, what does that word mean? So can you define, number one is, what is an ergogenic aid and why is caffeine considered one?
An ergogenic aid is anything which improves your performance. And the reason why I said previously that caffeine is probably one of the most studied ingredients in sports nutrition is because it has been shown to be an ergogenic aid, so improved performance in lots of different exercise environments and scenarios. So essentially an ergogenic aid is something which will improve your performance.
Okay, so we're looking at improving performance. Let's talk about really what does the research data provide when it comes to caffeine's impact on performance. Is there something that athletes should consider to include this as part of their nutrition or supplement protocol, and why?
Yeah, so should an athlete include caffeine? I think it depends, and I'll come on to that. But just to go back to like some of the research which is out there, some of the very early work looked at caffeine consumption, and firstly looking at cycling performance, which was the mode of exercise which was first used in these research studies. And this research that's been done on trained cyclists that were given a moderate dose of caffeine, so 5 milligrams per kilogram of body mass, before a cycling bout. And they found that exercise time to exhaustion was increased from 75 minutes in a placebo condition to 95 minutes when they had the caffeine. So you can see there that the cyclists were able to cycle for a lot longer period of time, so they got exhausted. So again, like, shows that caffeine was having a beneficial effect on that performance. And so since that kind of really early work back in the 1970s, even some studies before that, the research has continued to look at many different aspects of caffeine consumption in different sports. So now there's studies in running, in cycling, rowing, and some individual and team sports as well. Because now we have so much data, there's also a lot of meta-analysis that have come out and have also found caffeine to reliably enhance performance.
So you mentioned the endurance, the cycling, the running, right? I mean, I've talked to triathletes and like, I love my gel with caffeine somewhere midway through my race. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And I get that, right? So what about for the strength athlete? There's some data obviously on the endurance side where there's a benefit. Is there anything on maybe a sprinter, a strength and conditioning athlete, a football player, where this could help pre-game?
Yeah, so it's been studied in so many different sports. So yes, there is some evidence for strength athletes, for the intermittent type sport as well, having that caffeine pre-exercise. But I think you need to also take it into like the context of why you might be ingesting caffeine, and do you need it, and also if there's any adverse effects that might happen if you do ingest caffeine.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's talk about the opposite side, right? Because there's the beneficial side. Then there's individuals that might be like, hey, if I consume caffeine, it might make me feel anxious or this or that. Are there any areas where you've seen caffeine could hinder an athlete's performance, maybe increase anxiety, or I don't know, what could that be?
So that caffeine has been shown to elevate feelings of anxiety. So it's something that's an important consideration, I think, for athletes, to take that into consideration. Because if they're getting an increase in anxiety, it could actually become performance limiting or detrimental to their performance. So I think an individualized approach should be required. So there's some individuals that might need that increase in arousal prior to some competitions, and so caffeine's an effective way to achieve this. But for some major competitions where anxiety and arousal are already likely to be increased, then having that pre-competition caffeine might need to be avoided because it might over-arouse the athlete. And, I sometimes think about sports that require like really fine motor skills. Or is it the biathlon where they do the skiing and then the shooting? They need to obviously relax their heart rate and feel relaxed to be able to shoot and to shoot the target. So maybe caffeine might be too over-arousing for them and have detrimental effects.
Yeah, I know prior to football games in high school and other things where I played, I would get so nervous. And I wasn't drinking coffee back then when I was 16, 17. So I can imagine I'm a hyper person. It's like, caffeine would only just make me even more anxious. So I get it.
Yeah.
All right, let's.
And also, sorry, I was going to say about I can continue about some of the other side effects if you want to discuss them now.
Yeah. Any other side effects? Let's kind of talk about what are some of those other side effects we should be.
Only because I was just thinking as we were talking about like the anxiety, but then we also need to mention like the potential of caffeine to disrupt sleep. And that, like in loads of sporting contexts, like when competitions might occur in the evening, pre-exercise caffeine might have that like carryover effect of reducing sleep quality or sleep duration, and then maybe you're not recovering so well afterwards because you can't sleep as well. And also if there's like a tournament setting where you'll need to compete on multiple days, if you're having caffeine before each time you compete, again, you might not sleep that well afterwards, and then might have that rollover effect on how you might feel later in the competition.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned, the sleep component. Could that be related with caffeine's ability to increase heart rate? Maybe, I've noticed my heart rate obviously gets a little faster. It's a stimulant. Could that be a factor of why it's not something we should be consuming close to bedtime?
Yeah, it can be, but also as I discussed earlier on, it blocks those adenosine receptors, so it doesn't allow adenosine to cause that feeling, that sensation of sleepiness. So yes, I don't know if there's the research around the increase in the heart rate and it disrupting sleep, but I think the adenosine pathway and it antagonizing those receptors is one reason why we don't feel as sleepy when we've consumed caffeine.
When we look at safe dosage recommendations, one of the things, whether it's for athletes or any individual, is there a specific amount of caffeine we should be, focusing on? Like, is it a certain amount of milligrams, or is that dose dependent on the individual based on size?
Yeah, so in the research studies that have looked at caffeine for performance, if we think about athletes and performance for the first section which I speak about now, the early studies used to use quite moderate doses, and I think around 5 to 9 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. And because those doses were higher, there were more adverse effects that occurred because of that. And some people get GI distress or upset stomach if they've had too much caffeine. But there's been more recent work which has given a smaller dose, so around 3 milligrams per kilogram of your body weight. And that's found, again, an ergogenic effect on performance. So it might not be that we need to take these moderate high doses, what we used to think we needed to take, and that actually we can get a benefit in performance on the lower doses.
Yeah, and for our listeners, when they're going, okay, how do I do my weight to kilograms? Just take your body weight, divide it by 2.2, and then multiply it times 3 to 9. So that for a 200-pound person, that'll be about 300 to 900 milligrams or 800 milligrams a day, which I see a lot of people consuming a large cup of coffee from, like, let's say, a Starbucks, and they don't realize that has like 350 to 400 milligrams of caffeine, and they might go back for seconds. I'm like, you just about 800, 900. You might look like Beavis and the Great Cornholio. It's like jumping around and all hyper. So it's.
And I think if you look at the FDA recommendations, it says that around 400 milligrams a day is what they consider safe. But then the toxic levels are around 1.2 grams of caffeine. So really need to be careful of the units there and not get the grams and the milligrams mixed up.
One of the things I hear a lot about on the athlete side is if you drink too much caffeine, you have to really be concerned about dehydration. And we know hydration with a company like Gatorade, you're a hydration company, right? That's what you basically was discovered about, is hydrating athletes. And being that it could have a diuretic or may have a diuretic effect, are there any concerns in the research that you've seen with caffeine causing dehydration, or does it?
Yeah, so caffeine, I think when consumed in larger doses, may have a diuretic effect due to caffeine reducing the sodium reabsorption. But a lot of that research has used caffeine tablets, and so not looking at the fluid that you would ingest if you were to have a coffee, for example, where you're getting the caffeine and the fluid at the same time. So there was a more recent study that was done by Dr. Sophie Killer, and she looked at the effects of a moderate intake of coffee in caffeine habituated adults and compared that to if they just had water. across different days and looked at a whole range of hydration markers, and she found no difference in these hydration markers between the coffee and the water trial. So I think the conclusion of that paper is that if coffee is consumed in moderation in these caffeine habituated volunteers, then it has the same hydrating properties as water.
So listeners, it's okay to have caffeine and drink some coffee pre-event. Now, a couple of things I want to kind of just like as we get closer to the end of this is there's a lot of kids and adults consuming pre-workout supplements, right? And a lot of these pre-workout supplements are having caffeine and multiple stimulants. Now, is there a difference between synthetic caffeine and these pre-workouts like a caffeine anhydrous versus a natural source of caffeine like from coffee and tea, and how it affects the body?
Obviously, one is a natural source and the other one has been synthetically made, but will have a similar response on the body. I think one watch out with like the pre-workouts is just to be the pre-workout to be really cautious of the amount of caffeine that you are using, and to really look at the label to make sure that you're getting the right dosage when you make up the drinks. And especially for athletes, elite athletes, they just need to make sure that they are getting their pre-workout supplement from a reliable source.
Absolutely. Now, kind of off a little bit of topic, but similar topic. It's just, I've seen caffeine powder, right? Just kind of throwing a curveball at you. I recently saw a personal trainer, I think it was in the UK, you may have seen this, added caffeine powder before, and I think he added it to a pre-workout and boom, cardiac arrest, because the amount of caffeine in there was equivalent to 200 cups of coffee. And I was like, oh my goodness, that is instant, probably AFib or arrhythmia. And then boom. I mean, is that, you know, I don't want to, there's no specific question there, but it was more like, it seems like caffeine powder is extremely dangerous. And that is something just for our listeners to know, don't play around with caffeine powder. It's not like you're putting coffee grinds. You're getting pure caffeine.
Yeah, and I think a point just to reiterate what I just said is like around looking at labels and understanding the units that you're measuring it in. And when we've talked about the caffeine doses throughout this podcast, I've said like milligrams per kilogram of your body weight or milligrams per day. And a lot of our weighing scales that we have at home don't go that low and they're measured in grams. So it's like, it's really important to understand like the units that you are measuring it in. And if you're really uncertain, it's definitely safer to avoid it than to second guess the amounts that you're supposed to be taking.
Yeah, just, brew your coffee. Keep it simple. Don't do anything outlandish and consume all these crazy beverages that we just don't understand how much caffeine. The last, any closing remarks, any last, information that you would like our listeners to know just about just caffeine in general?
Yes, my big advice is to trial it. If you're going to use it and you want to use it for any performance improvements, please trial it in training before you try it in a race or in an important event, because as I said, some people do have GI disturbances with taking caffeine. So you want to make sure that if you're having it for competition, you can tolerate it and it won't be the reason why you don't finish your event.
Awesome. Dr. Randell, it's always a pleasure to have you as part of the All Me podcast and our guests. Fantastic information. We hope to have you back again in the very near future, because always high quality information the Gatorade Sports Science Institute provides to our listeners. Thank you so much for being here today and being in the UK in a different time zone. It's always good to work out something.
Great. Thank you very much.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.